Good morning or afternoon, depending on where you are. I had to look at the clock and see what time it was. It is time for Trading the Trend, which is another great webcast from Schwab Coaching. My name is Ben Watson. I'm an education coach and senior manager here at Charles Schwab, and I'm joined out here in the chat by my good friend, Connie Hill, who is a 20 plus year veteran in the financial markets and a great educator as well. And I am always grateful to have Connie out there in the chat, as well as being grateful for all of you joining me. Connie's there to help facilitate the conversation. If you're with us in the live version, thank you for being here. If you're with us in the recorded version, Connie won't be there, but you can always leave us a comment in the comment section and we'll get back to you as quickly as possible. So I'm filling in for James Boyd today, which means that I just have to give this short disclaimer. I am not James Boyd. I do not play James Boyd on TV. That would be a whole different ball game. So this isn't going to be a James Boyd webcast. We're going to talk about some different stuff. So this is going to be a one-off relative to some of the things that James talks about relative to trend. Fair warning, properly warned you be, says I. We're going to talk a little bit about the idea of how we might determine the probability or the likelihood that a trend may develop, first of all, and then the probability and likelihood that a trend may continue. Since the conversation is about trading the trend, it would be nice perhaps to have some idea of the likelihood that a trend may stay persistent. Of course, it's never a guarantee. Now, as we get into that discussion, a couple of things that we do need to keep in mind, those housekeeping items that we have to talk about. Remember that everything we talk about, simply for illustrative and educational purposes only, it isn't any kind of a recommendation or solicitation or advice or anything else about a particular strategy or stock or anything else. If we do happen to talk about trading options, remember that options carry high level of risk. They're not suitable for all investors. Make sure you're aware of the characteristics and risks of standardized options before considering any option strategy. Now, obviously, we're going to be using technical analysis in this discussion, as well as some other metrics, if you will, but technical analysis, fundamental analysis, probability analysis are all theoretical. None of those are guarantees as to what the market is going to do. And as such, Schwab doesn't recommend the use of technical analysis or really any one means as a sole means of investment research. We're going to be using the Thinkorswim desktop software platform today, specifically the paper money version of which. Now, there's one thing I'm going to warn you. We're going to talk a little bit about using some studies in scans today. Quick reminder, studies in scans do not work in paper money. So those would have to be done in a live account. But when you're moving your practice from paper trading to live, some of those things are different. Fill prices using studies. Just be aware of that as you move your practice from paper money to live trading, that there are some differences between the two as we get into this discussion. Neither one is a guarantee of future success out there in the real world. Also, remember that investing involves risk, including the loss of principal and things like stop orders, those types of things. They don't guarantee at what point the order is going to get filled. So we'll talk about that discussion as we get into this mix. So I want to pop over here really quickly to the Thinkorswim desktop software platform. And I wanted to talk about something that was kind of the inspiration for this discussion today. And it was this inclusion in the most recent iteration of the release notes for the June 6th Thinkorswim desktop software platform update. And that release note talks about using float in watch lists. Now, what's float? Float is the idea that taking out institutional ownership, taking out preferred stocks, taking out insider holdings. Float is basically the measurement of available shares to be traded. It's a little bit different than shares outstanding, because shares outstanding incorporates some of those other things like preferred notes and shelf registries and those types of things, right? Float is really kind of getting down to the nitty gritty of what number of shares are available. And I started to think about what float means, because there's kind of this whole discussion that goes on around float relative to things like short squeezes. When there's not a lot of shares available, it becomes difficult for short sellers to be able to cover those short positions by buying back shares, because there's got to be shares available, physical shares available, to be able to buy those shares back. And when there's not a lot of those shares available, the price goes up. So you get caught in that short squeeze type of idea. Well, float is kind of one of those interesting measurements, if you will, because it can give us an idea of how many shares are available. It also translates into things like days to cover for all of the available short positions relative to the float, gives you an idea of the number of days to go that it would take for all of those short positions to be covered by available shares. Again, that triggers the idea that the price of a stock could move very quickly, which is a great discussion. And it's a discussion that we've had a couple of times in a couple of different places. However, there's kind of another element to this, and that is that if we have a stock that has a larger float, that can be an indication that trends may be less explosive and more persistent, as opposed to making big moves. So stocks with small float might have explosive moves but no trend. Stocks with a huge amount of float might have not very explosive moves, but at the same time not very strong trends, because they just tend to kind of, pardon my pun, don't pardon my pun, long. But stocks that are kind of in the middle of that float range may tend to be those that get accumulated, and as they get accumulated, that accumulation causes price appreciation, i.e. trend in perhaps a bullish direction. Never a guarantee. And we're kind of like, it's a little bit like analyzing, well, I'll come up with an appropriate metaphor for that, but it is not a direct analysis of trend, but it is a metric or a measurement of how trend might develop. So starting from that understanding, knowing now that float is available as a watch list column, I wanted to see how we could use float in this process of determining stocks that might move in a particular trend. So I'm going to pop us over here to a chart really quick. And this is one of the results that I found, and I'm going to kind of work backwards from this in this discussion. This is Norfolk Southern, okay, railroad stock, transportations. We've seen transports doing well, especially because fuel prices are going up. That tends to benefit the rails strongly when diesel fuel prices go up. Rails are the most efficient per gallon use of diesel fuel in terms of moving goods, and so you tend to see intermodal traffic move back to the rails, and they're able to charge higher prices, and that's where we get this kind of a result on an earnings announcement like we're seeing here on Norfolk Southern. But it's also a stock that is in a fairly general and relatively gentle but pretty persistent. If we were to turn this out to, say, for instance, a 3-year weekly chart, you can see that that 3-year weekly chart is showing a pretty good, pretty consistent upward trend. So a trend trader, as opposed to maybe a swing trader, might be looking at a trend like this and saying, hey, that's a nice persistent trend. Again, not a recommendation, but just simply saying, look, this is a trend that's been persistent for the last 3 years at least, and it's generally been moving higher. We could use the 50, in this case, 30 week, which is almost a 200 period moving average. In this case, this is a weekly chart, has generally been moving higher, right? So how do we find a stock like this? Because this is always the question, and I get this question when we're teaching workshops. How do I find stocks that are gonna do this? So if we start this discussion, now that we have that understanding of float, from the basic premise of how do I find stocks that are likely to see persistent, durable trends? Well, now we got to kind of figure that out a little bit. So let's kind of see if we can kind of reverse engineer what's going on here in this particular stock of Norfolk Southern. Again, not a recommendation, but see if we can kind of go back and reverse engineer this process. So there's a couple of things that we're going to talk through in this discussion, and I'll show you the watch list first, and then we're really going to kind of go backwards, reverse engineering here in this. So the watch list that I was using to find this has some key components to it. And we're going to work our way back to a scan, which is how we're going to kind of drive this. But the things that I'm looking for are trend strength. First of all, trend strength. And all this is a calculated column that looks at where the price of the stock is relative to the 30 period simple moving average. Now, you could use an exponential, you could use a displaced, you could use a whole moving average. I know that happens to be James's kind of uh, moving average du jour, if you will. And you could use one of those too if you wanted to. I'm just simply using a simple moving average. Relative volume, which is looking at current volume versus average volume. And again, that's a calculated script column. By the way, yeah, I'll share all these with you so that you've got this toolkit. And then I'm looking at ADX, so trend strength, the trend strength gauge. I'm looking at RSI, relative strength index, which is a trend momentum component, giving us an idea of is price getting pushed up or is price getting pushed down. And then I'm looking at the volume average as kind of a filtering mechanism. And then I'm looking at float as kind of a durable trend gauge, if you will, or predictor, not a guarantee. So let me pop this open on the left-hand side here and kind of talk about what I wanted to see here. So in looking at this mix, this is kind of what I have. And there's a lot of different ways you can do it. This is just happens to be the way that we're going to look at this. So I'm going to be looking at relative volume as better than 1.5 times today's volume, better than 1.5 times the 30-day or 30 period average volume. That's the first kind of metric that we're going to get to here. I'm going to be looking at the RSI above 55 and the ADX above 20. Now, we're going to filter for that in our scan or our search. But all that is going to be a kind of a strength gauge, right? We're going to kind of put ourselves in the right neighborhood. Then I want to see price above a rising 30 period simple moving average. And that's where that trend strength metric comes into play. And once we've got all of that in the mix, then I'm going to use float and the size of the float as kind of a tiebreaker, if you will, as kind of the deciding factor. Because remember, float isn't going to guarantee the trend, but float is going to give us an idea. If we have a small float, it may very well be that the trend is too fast and it expends itself very quickly, right? If the float is kind of in the middle range, then that float maybe kind of gives an indication of a balanced perspective between a big driver of short-term movement versus trend persistence or durability. And then if we have greater than 500 million shares in float, typically that's an institutional holding that's going to have trends, but those trends may be a little bit slower in that perspective. So we're going to try to find stocks that are going to fall kind of right in this range between 50 million and 500 million in terms of float. Shares in terms of float is kind of our deciding factor. That's going to be our sweet spot, if you will. Now, I'm going to say this, and to Chris's point here, who brought this up, average volume as a percentage of float might be an interesting metric too. And yeah, that's a great metric. And that's going to give you an idea of that kind of, how long, once again, might it take to cover short positions. But I'm going to just give you blanket license at this point to play with all of this stuff and have at it, because I'm by no means suggesting that this is the only way that you can do this. This is just a thought experiment, if you will, kind of a thought process. So let's kind of continue to break this down. So now what we need to do is I need to kind of scan, maybe run a scan to put myself in the right neighborhood for this. So now that we've got that kind of metric here, and kind of our I don't know if maybe we could call those KPIs, right? We could call those KPIs, key performance indicators, to borrow a corporate buzzword. KPI, got to meet your KPIs. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over here to the scan tab, and I built a scan really quickly that is designed to kind of find us this relative sweet spot. Now, there's some functions of this scan that we kind of got to walk through. And remember that Studies in scans don't work in paper money. So again, we've talked about that. This, if you try to import this into your paper money account, the scan's not going to work because it's got studies in that mix. However, I'm going to start this discussion right now. And boy, I will tell you this. I know many, many of you are better at scanning and building scans than I. But I'm going to give it a shot here and I'm going to share this with you. And you can adapt this as you wish. Remember that our scans, watch list, shared items, all of those things are never guaranteed as to time or accuracy. They are simply illustrative and educational examples. So here's what we're looking at in this scan. I've got two things that are filtering it to begin with. The Venn diagram that I'm drawing to build this to begin with is the S&P 500. Now you could choose the NASDAQ, you could choose the Russell 2000 if you wanted to focus on small caps, whatever, right? Doesn't matter. But I'm focusing on the S&P 500, broad cross section of the market. So I'm scanning only in the S&P 500 and I'm intersecting with one simple thing, that's weekly options. Now, I'm not going to talk about option content in this discussion, other than to say the reason why I'm using weekly options as a filter in that Venn diagram is simply because I may want to have the option to trade options on these stocks at some point. Therefore, I want to make sure that they are available. So I want to filter that Venn diagram from that. So S&P 500 intersecting with weekly. So all the stocks that we should find should have options listed. Great. That's as far as we're going to go with the option content. Now, if you wanted to exclude something out of that Venn diagram that starts out the search, you could do that. You could exclude a particular industry group or particular category of stock or particular metric by excluding out of that list. Okay? And we've got lots of great webcasts that talk about how do you build scans and scan methodology and so forth. Now, the next thing I want to do is I wanted to set kind of a basic floor for the price of the stocks that we're looking at. So I chose mark price. You choose whatever you wanted. I chose mark and I said I want stocks that are marking at $20 or higher. I don't want to get down in the weeds in penny stocks. In this particular case, you could choose a higher filter, you could choose a lower filter, whatever you wanted. You could choose a max. I didn't put a max on this, but that took the list down from about 500 down to about 232 stocks. So that was our first filtering effort after the Venn diagram. Second thing was I put on a study here, average volume. The 30-period simple moving average of the volume is greater than 1 million shares. So I want stocks that are all trading better than 1 million shares average daily volume. Why? I want to be where the people are. I want to trade where the people are, right? That's all. I just want some liquid stocks. I'm not going after diamonds in the rough. I'm looking for liquidity. The next thing is I want to scan for stocks that are generally moving higher. So I want stocks where the price of the stock is above the 30-period moving average. It doesn't have to be big above the 30-period moving average. It doesn't have to be booming above the 30-period moving average. It just says, look, I want this moving average scan that says the closing price on the last bar is at least 0.5% above the 30-period simple moving average. And you can adapt it as you want to. If you wanted to make that the 50-period moving average or the 10-period moving average or a whole moving average, you can do that. Great, go ahead. I give you blanket license to do that. Who am I to tell you what to do with your scans and searches? But now that just simply gives me kind of a trend strength filter, and it is very similar to that trend strength custom column that I built in that watch list. So the next thing I'm adding to this mix is a study-based filter that says that the ADX is greater than 20. Because remember, this was our kind of our filter over here on the left-hand side. RSI greater than 55 and ADX greater than 20. So there's what we have, right? So I've got good relative volume. I've got ADX better than 20. I've got RSI greater than 55. And really all that's doing in this particular case is giving me strong stocks that are maybe already a strong trend. So I'm kind of already identifying good candidates here. Again, not a guarantee that these candidates are good candidates or bad candidates or the trend is going to stay persistent, but that's what we're trying to figure out in this mix. So I'm going to run that scan, and running that scan, I currently get 40 results. Now, because I have saved this, scan result that I shared with you there, it now becomes a dynamic watch list. So whenever I pull up that watch list, it's going to run this scan first, and then it's going to sort according to whatever column headers that I have, right? So Zynq says, what's the weekly in the intersect field? Options, weekly options. It's intersecting with stocks that have weekly options. Why do I like the ADX so much? Great question, Koala. Because the ADX doesn't care about trend direction. The ADX is simply a strength gauge, whether that trend is going up or whether that trend is going down. It's kind of a cool indicator that way, and kind of cool the way that Wells Wilder built that is to kind of be agnostic to trend direction and simply give me a trend strength gauge, right? It's just like saying, hey, I could be going up the hill or down the hill, but how fast or how strongly is that movement happening? All right, so now that I've got that list, I've saved this. I'm going to go back to my watch list, or my market watch tab, and here's the watch list that I've got. It's called Trend Probability. It's my personal watch list. Trend Probability Scan, because that was the name of my scan, Trend Probability. And now I've got this dynamic watch list. And you could build it too. You've got the scan. So if you just save that scan result, now you've got your own, whatever you name it. You could call it something else besides Trend Probability Scan. I just happen to call it Trend Probability Scan. And my column headers for this, if I do my customize this column set, here's what I've got. Symbol, description, last. So I'm seeing the last trading price. Trend strength, relative volume, ADX, RSI, volume average, and float. That's what I'm displaying in this particular case. So the trend strength calculated column is simply this calculation, right? I'm looking at where price is relative to that 30-period moving average. Now I can edit it here in that tool, all right? Relative volume is simply volume, today's trading volume, divided by average volume on a 30-day period or a 30-period time frame. So it's taking volume relative to the 30-period average volume of the stock. That's our relative volume calculation, okay? And that's going to then be expressed, that relative volume, as a ratio, right? So 1.48 means that the current volume for Norfolk Southern is 1.48 times the 30-day average volume. Today's volume is 1.48 times the 30-day average volume. So it's giving me a kind of a indicator. That's a lot like the sizzle index, if you will. You could perhaps even use, if you wanted to simplify it and you didn't want to use that relative volume, you could use the sizzle index there as well. ADX, again, just using that trend strength. And all I did is I set a calculation that said, in building this, ADX above 20, RSI above 55, right? And that's how I came to that scan result. Now I'm just showing ADX and RSI here in this column. So all of those results should be in this list 20 or above. All of these results in the RSI list should be 55 or above. And then volume average is just that 30-period volume average. And then I'm showing float and current float. Now, the other choice that you have in current and float is 5-year average float. So if you wanted to smooth that out a little bit, you could use that 5-year average float. But boy, a lot of stocks in the last 5 years have changed their float amounts. So that might be misleading a little bit to go down that path of 5-year average float. All right, so now that I've got that list, let me do this. I'm going to share this list, and I've got the scan criteria here. Let me see if I can share this with you. And not sharing this as a watch list, but sharing this as a column header list so that you've got those indicators. So let me do that. And again, remember that shared items, including column headers, are not guaranteed as to time, or accuracy. Okay, so now you've got that list. So now what do we do? Now let's kind of go through this process. If my biggest concern is going to be volume, right? I mean, I think trend strength and volume, kind of the indicator here. And let me explain that trend strength column. So a trend strength indicator, if I were to bump this back down, this trend strength indicator, so a trend where price is above the 30 period moving average, but staying kind of the same, has an indicator of 1.0. Trend that is above the 30 period moving average and is rising has an indicator of 2.0. So 2.0 is what I'm looking for in terms of trend strength. A trend strength gauge of 2.0 is kind of that category. So really the first thing I could sort this by is that trend strength indication. But I'm going to sort this back by relative volume again, because I want that strongest mix of relative volume. I want it better than 1.5, that ratio better than 1.5. I only have one on this list that has a higher relative volume than 1.5. Most of them are a little bit less. Most of them are a lot less in this particular case. So I'm going to sort by that relative volume. So if we kind of think about where our cutoff is in terms of what we're going to be looking at now, it's probably going to be right in that range. So that's going to give us these names right here. So we've got Thermo Fisher, Norfolk Southern, Union Pacific Rails, RTX Rails, CSX or Technology and Aerospace, and CSX Rails. 3 rail stocks. Who knew that our trend probability was going to come in? Well, maybe that is appropriate though, because think about rails, and once you lay those rails, they stay that trend in that direction until you rip up the rails. So I'm not saying that the rails stocks trend in a particular direction as if they were on rails, but maybe they do. Huh, interesting. All right, so we're going to focus on those that have relative volume, in this particular case, better than 1. We'll just call it that. And so we notice that all of those have an ADX indication better than 20, because that's how we filtered for them. And they have an RSI number better than 55, or better than 20, and better than 55 on the RSI. Now, some of those are kind of high RSI numbers. And you might say, well, wait a second, maybe we need to filter that back a little bit. And that's where we kind of get into this second section of stocks here that have decent relative volume, but are kind of in that middle section. We've got 1, 2, 3 of those that are kind of in that middle section in terms of RSI, Supermicro, AT&T, Deere, that are kind of in that middle section. Okay, now the tiebreaker, if you will, for this is going to be float. So here's what I'm going to look at. I'm going to look at stocks. Again, I'm going to be looking for stocks that are in that 50 million to 500 million balanced range in terms of float, tending to see proportional float relative to trend. They're not overwhelmingly large float, nor are they small float. So I'm going to be looking at stocks in this particular case, everything but, for instance, RTX, CSX, those two I'm going to take out of the mix. These two I'm going to take out of the mix simply because their float is too high. Now, we could go with them, but it just suggests that maybe they move a little more slowly than that intermediate term trend trade perspective might project. So I'm going to use, that really kind of focuses then on Thermo Fisher, Norfolk Southern, and Union Pacific, right? Cool. Okay. All right. So I might have to share those individually because I don't know if I share that. Wait, hang on a second. Hang on a second. Thank you for letting me know. Let's do this. Trend probability. Can I share this column set? Let's see. Can I? I don't know if I can. Let's see. Can that be shared? Okay, but let's do this. Let me do this really quick because I want to get to this real fast. Let me share trend strength. Again, remember These are for illustrative and educational purposes only. There's trend strength, and let's share relative volume. The others are pretty easy. Let's share relative volume. So there's the one for relative volume. There you go. Cool. All right, now you got them. And like I said, I'll put them in the description for this webcast. But now you got them. I don't want anybody to go away thinking, "Wow, I didn't give you anything." Okay, so we got 3 stocks on this list: Thermo Fisher, Norfolk Southern, Union Pacific, that kind of fit within our category. Wow, that was easy. We filtered from 250 down to 3 pretty quickly. Now, it's not a guarantee that they're going to be either in a trend or that the trend is going to be persistent, but now it gives us an opportunity to kind of find that sweet spot, if you will. So how did I create the special columns? I will tell you this. I'm going to show you RG out in the webcast where you're going to find some ThinkScript ideas for how you build those custom columns. So let's go to the first one here, which is Thermo Fisher on this list. Has the highest relative volume. So it's probably seeing some volume today, which also tells me that it's probably got earnings, given where we are in the characteristics. Let's go over to the chart here for Thermo Fisher. And it does. In fact, that may be one of the reasons why, this volume is exceptional today, right? So, but here's the thing to think about. If we're talking about a trend strength indicator, look at what's going on, right? We've got, from a technical analysis perspective, we've got a breakout above a resistance area. We've got kind of this double bottom or kind of wide double bottom type of pattern that's now broken out on the earnings announcement. And it's got an increase in strength of the trend, meaning the ADX is turning up, and the RSI is turning up as well. So on this earnings announcement, we've got a breakout. Now, granted, it's backing off a little bit on this move to the upside. However, that doesn't invalidate this entry into the trade given the characteristics that we've looked at. So we're going to look at, I'm going to just simply enter a trade here, and I'm going to put this in my market movers group. Now, I could put a stop on this. I could manage this using a trailing stop, whatever we wanted to do, subject for another webcast. But I'm going to right click. I'm just going to simply buy. And again, not a recommendation, just simply an illustrative example. I'm going to buy, and I'm going to put this in my market movers group. So we're going to buy 100 shares of TMO, Thermo Fisher, at that price. 572.11 is what we got, right? As we, again, this is where we would manage that trade, either with, some form of protective strategy or a stop loss order. But for the sake of this webcast and the time that we've got in this webcast, I'm not going to go deep into that thought process. So now let's go back to our MarketWatch tab. And by the way, we've got 3 calculated columns here, or 2 calculated columns. So it may take a while for this watch list of 40 results at the moment to repopulate. So just be aware of that. Now I'm going to go to Union Pacific, the one that we have not looked at yet besides Norfolk Southern. We're going to go to Union Pacific. A little bit higher float, little bit stronger ADX, so a little bit stronger trend strength, a little bit lower RSI, but a little bit lower relative volume, but still a strong trend. So we're going to click on Union Pacific. We're going to go over to our chart. I've got those 2 linked up. This is Union Pacific. Sure enough, also another earnings announcement. So maybe I'm just noticing something, that maybe that's the driver for that average volume or that relative volume indicator. So maybe we've got to X the earnings out of the mix to get a truer picture, but I'm okay with that volume on earnings because that's usually where you're going to see bigger volume these days anyway, because volume tends to get normalized. But nevertheless, notice what I've got. I've got a bounce or a breakout of that resistance level. This has been in a persistent trend. 30-period moving average is turning up. 10-period moving average is turning up. It's broken above that resistance level. And the RSI slightly lower high, so you might say that's a bit of a bearish divergence, but at the same time, trend strength is increasing and it's not at an extreme, so maybe there's some room for this to continue to move to the upside. So some traders might look at this and say, hey, I want to wait for a bounce in this particular case. So that is one way to go about doing this, is waiting for that bounce. I'm just going to simply get in and assuming that if this holds above that, in fact, what I'm going to do is I'm going to come down to this next level, which would be a break of the 10-period moving average. And we'll just do this real quick. Right click, we're going to buy custom with stop. And again, remember, stops don't guarantee at which point, what price we're going to get out. They just guarantee what price we're going to activate the trade. So we're going to get in around 302.73 and looking at where that support level is down around 290.83. That's where we might exit the trade if it goes against us. 290.83 and make that good till canceled. And then I'm just going to simply look at getting into the trade here, and that limit order to get into the trade, we'll put this in our market movers group, click on send and fire that order off. And we'll see if that fills. It's currently sitting at 303.62. Our limit price was just a little bit under that, 303.42. We'll see if it comes back just a little bit and gets in. Or we could move that up a little bit to try to work our way into the trade a little bit so that we don't potentially miss out, because it's starting to bounce up off of that level of support. So just for the sake of getting into the trade, I'm going to grab that. I'm going to move that limit up just a little bit. Click on confirm and send that order off. We just did a confirm, cancel and replace. Now we're into the trade at 303.66, right? Okay. All right, so there we go. Now we're in the trade. We got to stop on that trade. Last one we're going to look at back again is, we go back to our Market Watch tab. But you know what? We looked at Norfolk Southern at the very beginning, and that's how we got to that list. There's Norfolk Southern. And we go back to the chart, and it's going to be very similar to the others that we just looked at, right? Gap up, broken above that resistance level, RSI moving up, ADX moving up. So I want to just try something here real quick in the few minutes that we've got before we go. Is this. I'm going to pop back over here to the Market Watch tab, and I'm going to come back down here into something that is in kind of middle range again, but still has a strong trend, but maybe has a little bit lower RSI, maybe hasn't broken out yet, maybe has already had an earnings announcement. So I'm going to sort this list once again by relative volume, make sure that I've got that relative volume higher up here at the top. And I'm going to find something that maybe has some, well, let's take a look at this one. Let's take a look at 3M. This is kind of interesting. On the higher end of float, RSI is in the 60s, ADX is in the 20s, relative volume is a little bit lower today, but it's a strong trend. So we'll see if that gives us an idea of when a trend might start, or the potential beginning of a trend. So let's take a look at 3M. Aha, interesting. It's already seen that gap up to the upside. So that could be an opportunity in terms of holding that level of support. I want to go back to that watch list. Now I want to choose one maybe that has that earnings announcement, but maybe we come down here into this range and we go to like Dell, for instance, or Cintas, maybe Cintas. So 69 on the RSI, 32 on the ADX, 45 on the relative volume, 2.0 on the trend strength, and the float's a little bit lower, but they're already past their earnings announcement, or earnings is still far enough that it's not popping up on the flag here. So let's go to Cintas, let's go to the charts. Aha, look at what we just found here in terms of this trade. It's past their earnings announcement, so that big move volume-wise has already happened. But look at what that's giving us is that little bit of a pullback as a possible entry into a close above or a trade above the high of the low day. And we're right there. So I'm going to right click and I'm just going to buy that. We're going to put that in our Market Watch or Market Movers group. And we're going to get into that trade on the basis of that bounce higher here. Again, not a recommendation, just simply an illustrative and educational example. So I'm looking for a break to get into this particular trade. We're going to do that on a buy stop, or excuse me, a buy limit of 202.64. So if it can come down there a little bit, let's maybe bump that up just a little bit because I want to get into this. 202.93, click on send, we'll cancel and replace that order, and now we're in. I didn't want to chase it too much, but I wanted to chase it a little bit just so that I could get into the trade. So what this has done in going through this, Zinc, just for time, right? Just for time is all. In terms of that characteristic, I'm just doing that for time. All right. So what we've done is we built a scan and we scanned for stocks that kind of put us in the right neighborhood. And then we took the scan results because we saved the scan. We took those scan results as a watch list, and I built this custom column header list with trend strength, relative volume, ADX, RSI, volume average, and float. Floats are deciding factor. So what then looks like is this. Relative volume better than 1.5, so more than 1.5 times average volume. RSI strong, ADX strong, price above the rising 30-period simple moving average, and float is our tiebreaker. Too small a float could be too fast. Too large a float could be too slow. Maybe this is the Goldilocks right there, 50 million to 50 million in float as an indication of balanced trend potential. Not a guarantee by any means. So let's do this. Guys, let's pop over here really quickly to our Thinkorswim, or excuse me, to our Trader Talks webcast page. Connie says she ran that for float. I'll do another webcast here pretty soon as far as float is concerned. Maybe I'll do a short video on float, talking about what float is and how it could be used. But if you type in the words trend strength, and now you're going to get things like ADX to spot early signs of trend strength, trading the trend. Connie talking about stocks to trade start with sector strength and trend confirmation. So a lot of different tools there. Here's Connie's kind of gold standard for trend strength. Is trend strong or weak, using ADX to determine trend strength. So Connie does a great job for that. And I did share that Market Watch tab so that you've got that. It's up in the list here a little bit. I will put all of those shared items in the description for this particular webcast. By the way, click on subscribe here if you haven't already, and give us a follow on social media at Ben Watson CS on X, at Connie Hill CS on X. And if you want to join us, we're going to be in Dallas next week and for the Market Drive event, which is a one-day event. Then we're going to be in Orlando the 7th and 8th doing technical analysis and option strategies. Then we're going to be in New York doing advanced option strategies coming up on the 28th and 29th. Guys, thanks very much. My thanks to Connie Hill for helping out. My thanks to all of you for participating in this discussion. My thanks to our great production staff and our reviewers who are awesome as well. Have a great day, everybody. We'll see you soon. Take care. Bye-bye.